Okay, welcome everyone to SADS Foundation's Living with SADS webinar series. Today, in recognition of National Family Health History Month, we are presenting this webinar on genetic testing. What's all the fuss about a VUS? I'm Marcia Baker, the Program Director for the SADS Foundation. We're pleased you're taking time to join us tonight. And now I'd like to introduce our presenter who will help educate us about the importance of genetic testing for you and your family. Genetic counselor Brittney Murray. Brittney is a genetic counseling manager of the Center for Inherited Heart Disease at Johns Hopkins. She specializes in arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathies and helping families with sudden death. She is a member of the Clinical Genome Resource Expert Gene Panel and Expert Variant Panel on ARVC, DCM, and cardiomyopathy. She is passionate about access to genetic counseling, and her research focuses on genetics of arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathies and genetic counseling outcomes. We have a lot of time for Q&A following Brittney's presentation. You may type your question in the Zoom chat, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. You may also raise your hand, and I'll call on you to unmute yourself to ask your question verbally if you prefer. As a reminder, please mute yourself during her presentation. So we're thrilled to welcome Brittney Murray. Thank you for volunteering your time for SADS Foundation tonight. Over to you, Brittney.
Thanks, Marcia. Do you want to hold all, are you going to collect all questions and hold them to the end?
We'll hold them and we'll put them in, yes, at the end from the chat. You'll see them come in.
All right, sounds good.
Okay.
Well, hello everyone. Good evening and happy Thanksgiving week. This is a great topic to discuss right before Thanksgiving and all the winter holidays because not only am I going to be talking about variants of uncertain significance tonight in VUSs, but I'm going to kind of couch that in the larger discussion about family screening and big family get-togethers sometimes can be a good time to get this information to family members, although it's not necessarily the most lively topic, but it's a really good time when you see a lot of your family members and you're updating them on your life to pass this information along. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Also, an open book as much as possible. I'll try to answer your questions the best I can, without, of course, knowing the specific clinical details, but I can definitely answer broadly. So let's talk about genetic testing and family screening. So largely, this is becoming less and less of a needed slide nowadays, but just to be inclusive and, really bring everyone in, what is genetic testing? Genetic testing is, sometimes we think about a spell checker that looks through the instructions for parts and pieces of your body, looking for misspellings or changes. And those misspellings or changes in genes can lead to different diseases. Blood is the best sample, but nowadays, honestly, cheek cells are perfect. We really don't need blood most of the time. However, in autopsy cases, which we're always, really thinking about in the sudden death families, blood is the best specimen we have. And we always recommend meeting with a genetics professional because they're really going to help you understand what you're looking at, what the outcomes of the test are, and what the results mean, most importantly, which in most cases is actually the trickiest part. So again, just a primer to make sure we're all on the same page, although more and more everyone knows this, but what is a gene versus a protein versus a heart? So genes are our genetic information, which are in the nucleus of our cell. They provide the instructions for parts and pieces of our body. Genes encode proteins. Our whole body is made up of protein. You'd be surprised the number of people I talk to about that. They're like, I didn't realize, that my heart is protein. Well, really, we're talking about RNA or the specific little protein building blocks of your heart itself. So then in disease, for example, I specialize in ARVC, which a lot of you know. So this picture here is of the desmosome, the connections between your heart cells. So when there is a error in the genetic code, that leads to the protein in the heart not being made correctly, and that's what leads to the weakening of the connections between your heart cells. So we hear a lot of time when people say, well, I have that ARVC gene. Well, what does that really mean? We all have the ARVC genes. All humans have desmosomes, and so therefore you have the genes that are implicated in ARVC. What you have in an individual who has ARVC is they have what we call pathogenic variant, or a variance or a change in how the spelling of that gene is supposed to be that then causes the disease. So, having the gene is a little bit, doesn't make any sense. So who should get genetic testing? So now it is very clear that any individual with features of a SADS condition should get genetic testing. Also, all first-degree relatives meaning parents, siblings, and possibly children of someone who has a known pathogenic variant identified can undergo testing for the known variant in the family. Honestly, for most SADS conditions, we do recommend talking about and testing children. We don't wait until they're adults because most SADS conditions can present in childhood. And so waiting until they're adults can be too late. So the thing that I always recommend is if you have a known pathogenic variant that tracks in your family, it's unlikely that there is a secondary variant. So you don't have to have continual repeat genetic testing over time. However, again, always speak with your healthcare team, your genetic counselor. If your family history isn't really making sense for the pathogenic variant in your family, we do know that about 10% of families have more than one pathogenic genetic change. But again, most of the time that is not the case, but you can always check with your healthcare team. So we're really at a place now where genetic testing is universally strongly recommended by all major cardiac organizations, societies, and all expert recommendations and position papers. So this is one of the first recommendations that came out that I remember when this came out. We were really excited back in 2011 when the Heart Rhythm Society came out with this consensus statement strongly recommending genetic testing. It was one of the first ones that we had. And nowadays, last summer, Dr. Vilda and a whole team just presented this huge expert consensus statement on recommendations for genetic testing. And the reason why that's important is because we're finally at a place now where we have this over on the left side of the screen, that for all of the arrhythmia syndromes and cardiomyopathies, the classic ones anyway, not only does the genetic test help in diagnosis, but we're also at a place where it is now important for therapeutics and prognosis. So not only does it help us diagnose you, but it tells us how your course is going to go and what your best treatment is. And so this is why, all cardiac genetic counselors are super busy now, because any physician who's following the guidelines of how you should treat a patient with a SADS condition is recommending genetic testing because they want to know how to manage you. So it's not just about family anymore, even though we're going to talk about family screening today. That's always a really important part of genetic testing. But now we're at the point where genetic testing is actually informing your management. And this on the right is from the American Heart Association. This is their 2020 scientific statement as well, really reiterating that the genetic test result can play an important part in the management. So another part where genetic testing is helpful is because family history is not always predictive. So sometimes in the different SADS conditions that I see, family histories look like this, right? And so this is obviously, quote unquote, genetic. We have multiple affected individuals. We have all of these people in black who were affected, have the known genetic mutation, and then we see it being passed on to the next generation. So this is obviously a familial disease because many members of this SIBship have it. But many, in fact, over 50% of the families that I see look like this, that you have one person in the family affected, and then I can track that mutation back through the family. And it doesn't necessarily show up or express itself in other family members. So many family members can be asymptomatic carriers, but that doesn't mean that they're not at risk to develop disease later, or that other people in their family are not at risk. So genetic testing can be extremely important for identifying who needs to be screened. And that is because for all SADS conditions, symptoms are an incredibly unreliable screening tool. So the number one thing that I hear from family members when they're thinking, when we talk about genetic testing for the condition that is in the family, is they say, well, I feel fine. I've never had any symptom, or, I've lived this long and I was athletic before, so I would have showed symptoms by now. We know, and every single study says that that's wrong, that many, many patients have disease without any overt symptoms. So on the left here, this is arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathy and phospholamban carriers, really showing that completely pre-symptomatic or concealed and subclinical, these patients already have structural changes of cardiomyopathy and potentially are at risk of sudden death. And then this is an old paper. It's over a decade old at this point, but way back in 2013, we published in autopsy cases of ARVC, we found that there were a number of patients. So in patients that didn't necessarily have a family history, up to 50% of autopsy cases of ARVC, that sudden cardiac death, that cardiac arrest was their first symptom. They had never had a symptom prior. On the other hand, this decreases when you have a family history of disease, presumably because some of these people were more aware of their family history and getting screened appropriately. We know that that is even less, close to zero, in patients who have appropriately cascade tested throughout their family, that almost all the SADS conditions are identifiable before that risk of sudden cardiac death shows up. And so it can be really, really important to get screened either with genetic testing or cardiac screening, because symptoms literally don't mean anything to me. This gets into a little bit, I won't belabor this, but this is the secondary benefit beyond family identification of genetic testing, that, for example, this is in long QT syndrome. There is a whole very systematic management cascade based on what genetic subtype of long QT syndrome you have. We're also now getting to a place where we have that for ARVC, and we have that for some of the other SADS conditions as well, that it's not everyone is being managed the same. We're finally kind of realizing the promise of precision medicine, in that we are treating you not necessarily based on your label, but what the actual underlying problem is for you, your genetic mutation or pathogenic variant. And then this also, like I said, factors into guideline management in ARVC as well. So what, if you have genetic testing, what are the potential results that you can get? So you can get what's called a positive result. Positive just means that we found something. Most people are familiar with this language now because you talk about a positive COVID test. But in genetic testing, it's a positive result means we found something that makes sense for the disease you have. It confirms your diagnosis, enables those management changes, and then it is able to prompt that cascade family segregation, where we're testing family members to determine who else is at risk. If your genetic testing is negative, meaning you did not find any genetic risk factors that make sense for the disease you have, that does not necessarily mean that you don't have that condition or that your condition is not genetic. We run into that all the time, that patients say, well, oh, I have, non-genetic long QT syndrome. Well, it's not really a thing. We know that there is still some residual risk to family members, and And so in that case, we don't really call this gene negative. We've turned to calling this gene elusive to really get across that it's not that you have non-genetic form, it's that we don't understand the genetic contribution to your disease yet. Most of the time, we do recommend some family screening associated with that. It varies significantly based on underlying diagnosis through all the SADS conditions. So I would, again, talk to your healthcare team if you have a gene elusive SADS condition, what the recommendation for screening is in your family specifically, because it varies based on condition and it also varies based on your family history. The good news is that for many of these conditions with a negative or not strong family history, and you don't have the known genetic risk factor, our family screening recommendations are usually looser than we do in those that have a known genetic cause, probably because your cause of disease was likely what we call polygenic, meaning that there's probably a whole host of genetic risk factors that contributed to your disease, not one big genetic risk factor. And we know that every single gene in your body is inherited independently. And so if you have a more complicated genetic contribution to why you got disease, it is less likely for family members to also show up. But as we were just talking today in our weekly meeting, we definitely have those families that it is very, very clear that we are missing the one monogenic form in their family. It's so strongly inherited. So there's still some more genetic work to do in the research front. On the other hand, negative genetic testing sometimes can be a great thing, meaning if you have a known pathogenic risk factor in your family that has been confirmed by an expert to be the cause of the disease in your family, and you test negative for that risk factor, that basically absolves you of almost all risk most of the time. And so that is really great news, because then we know that you're essentially, in most cases, a general population risk and you don't need regularly followed. So that's a great potential benefit of genetic testing. I always remind people that there's an equal chance of potentially getting out of all this stuff. Most, again, speaking broadly about all SADS conditions, I can't speak to every case, but most SADS conditions are inherited in what's called a dominant manner, meaning that it's 50-50 if you pass this risk on to first degree relatives. And so if you have genetic testing, there's an equally likelihood that you either do have the genetic risk factor in the family or that you get out of having to do any screening at all, which is great. And then there's always the third possibility, which in my clinic, I call the gray result. So we have black, white, and gray, which is the most complicated, which I'll spend a little bit of time talking about. Oh, so this is a little bit what I already talked about on the other slide, that screening is still recommended. None of the inherited SADS conditions have 100% yield on genetic testing. So we still recommend screening. Okay. So I want to speak a little bit more on gene elusive family screening. Like we said, many times we back up and we don't recommend as intensive screening in gene elusive families, but we do still have those families where it is very strong familial risk. And even though we don't have a genetic risk factor identified, we see it tracking in the family. Usually I will tell those families point blank in clinic, it is very clear that this is genetic XYZ condition. Your family members still need screened. We just don't have a tool to release people. We don't have a tool to tell people they're not at risk. However, it is well known, published, documented, and daily in my clinical practice that uptake of screening in gene elusive families, cardiac screening, is complicated and lower than in gene positive families. It can be really, really helpful for your healthcare team to write you very specific letters to share with your family about why and what type of screening is recommended, because then they can take those letters to their local physicians who may not be as knowledgeable. The number of times that I have had local physicians say, oh, you have non-genetic long QT, your family members don't need screened. they just might not know. And so it can be very helpful to have that documentation to share with your family. So now circling back to a VUS, which I was going to talk about next. So what is a VUS, or variant of uncertain significance? So technically, the American College of Medical Genetics says that anything that you are less than 90% sure is the cause of disease in that change, that variant changes and damages the protein. Anything less than 90% confidence, you have to call it a VUS. And so a VUS varies widely from those that we are very, very sure are nothing, aka less, a 10%, 15% chance that may be something, but we're pretty sure it's nothing. It has to be, there's a less than 10% chance that this is something to officially downgrade it to benign. So we can go all the way from that to, very close to 90%. So we're almost there. We're super suspicious that this can be the genetic cause in your family, but we just don't have that extra proof. So VUS is a big, wide, messy bin. The American College of Medical Genetics is changing that classification slightly, which those recommendations will come out next year. But for right now, clinicians are just left with this, gray area. So why could we potentially be uncertain about a specific change? So as I've discussed before, that mutation or variant, all it means is that there's a change in the reference sequence that we think it should be. Now, back when the human genome was sequenced, it was done on an old white man. And so we are continuing to gain information about, actually different ancestry backgrounds have a different overall spelling of the genome. And so we're getting more and more information about the common spellings of the different genes and other ancestry backgrounds. So we're getting so much better at that. The big database we have for that now has over 1 million people in it. So we can get much better of what common variation is in the population. Because sometimes the gene can be spelled a different way in a different ancestry background, and that's totally normal and does not hurt that gene at all, or that protein at all. Sometimes I like to use this analogy in clinic, which more and more I like to say is just really dating me on how old I'm getting, apparently, when I compare this to Legos and Lincoln Logs. I had Lincoln Logs growing up. But Lego is like, if you think of the protein building block tower that makes up your heart, you can switch out a red Lego and a yellow Lego, and it doesn't have any impact on your tower at all. We have lots of variation in our genes that is benign, that is like switching out Legos. Doesn't matter in the overall structure whatsoever. But sometimes you can have one of those switch outs or one of those changes, and even though they're both building blocks, it's like switching a Lego for a Lincoln Log. Those no longer work together. They do not hook together. You cannot build a tower with them. So that is actually damaging. So a lot of the work and investigation I do is trying to determine if these VUSs are like another Lego or a Lincoln Log, right? A lot of the analysis that I do is looking into these variants and analyzing them and what they're doing to the protein and population frequency. So this on the right is a genetic test report from an old patient, probably close to a decade ago at this point. And this variant that was found was a secondary variant. They had a clear pathogenic deletion, missing information. That's clearly bad in the PKP2 gene, so they had ARVC. But what did this other variant do? It's just a switch out of one protein building block for another. Well, then we were able to see at the time, which is going to be way more frequent now, that in these big population databases that we look at, oh my gosh, there's tons of people, 60 people walking around that have that exact same genetic change and are not reported to have any cardiomyopathy. So this is probably just benign background variation as well. And there's a whole host of computer modeling and all sorts of other tools that I look into when I'm trying to make an assessment if this change is something that contributes to your disease risk or not. I want to talk a little bit though about why we look into VUSs so carefully and why we don't really assume anything, but yet sometimes still pay attention. Misinterpreting a VUS can have a huge impact on management in a family. There's this publication, which is again a little bit old now, from 2016, but we hear so many stories of, in the cancer field, cancer genetics, people getting mastectomies for a breast cancer risk gene that turned out to be a general population variant that meant nothing, and they've had a mastectomy already. I have seen multiple families in my practice over the years where multiple people in a family got inappropriate ICDs implanted based on misinterpretation of genetic test results. So it's really, really important that you go to an expert who knows what they're doing with these. The reason why they're important to pay attention to and not just always ignore is sometimes VUSs can be upgraded. This is an ARVC family that I have followed for a number of years. This person had a cardiac arrest. They thought maybe she had myocarditis. She had genetic testing. She had a VUS and one of the ARVC genes, and they were like, it's a VUS. We don't know what to do with that. So they didn't do anything further. They didn't look into it any further. They didn't recommend any screening for the family. Meanwhile, then her first cousin, has a cardiac arrest. No one had recommended any screening, no one recommended any follow-up. Then I get involved and I start tracking through the family. Turns out her aunt also had a cardiac arrest, has a cardiomyopathy, and then her mother was asymptomatic, but on family screening had a cardiomyopathy as well. And I was able to track this mutation, this VUS, through all of these affected people, therefore proving it was the cause of the disease in this family and getting that upgraded and enabling other people to get pre-symptomatic genetic testing. So this is why it's really, really important to work with somebody who's going to look into this in your family. On the other hand, and the reason why we don't go screening people for VUSs just in case is because VUSs can also be downgraded. This is another example of a guy who had a arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathy and had a VUS in a gene. And many times, and a lot of practitioners say, hey, they have a variation in a gene that is the gene for the disease they have. Must be true Turin related. Nope, sometimes it can just be completely coincidental. And this guy had that VUS. His dad was dead, and so we didn't really have anyone to try to track it and to prove that it was. For many years, I told him, I was like, hey, this is a really suspicious VUS, but I'm really cautious to test your family members for it. Family members should just be screened with cardiac testing. Lo and behold, then years later, his brother turned out to have an arrhythmic cardiomyopathy as well. I told him, I was like, this is our chance. We could potentially prove that this is the cause in your family. But when I tested his brother was negative for the VUS that he had. And then also turns out it's a common variant in the general population. So I was so glad that I had never told him that that was the answer in his family, because with additional information, we proved that it wasn't. And there are all of these 3 healthy boys down here who could have potentially been told that they were not at risk if they were negative for that VUS, when in fact, we don't know whether they're at risk at all. This is another one of those clearly genetic risks that is gene elusive right now. And there are plenty of people in this pile. And so again, just another plug for making sure that you're going to a cardiogenetics expert that really knows what they're doing. This is a 2016 study from Chloe Reuter, one of my really good colleagues and friends really at Stanford. And she found that almost 100% of cardiac genetic counselors don't just take the lab report at face value, that they gather additional information. And the really important part is that in 15% of these cases, there was a clinically significant discord based on expert opinion and what was just on the lab report. So it's very important to make sure that you have someone who knows what they're doing looking at your test results. Genetic counselors like myself and my colleagues are really here to be part of your healthcare team. We routinely help people with new diagnoses, help them get their family screened, help them with communication in their family. Most of families that I'm talking to have a risk of or have a history of sudden death in their family, or a risk of sudden cardiac arrest, which can bring a lot of grief and loss about a lot of various things. So that's something that I'm routinely talking about. And I spend a lot of time talking about lifestyle modifications. And so all of these things are well within what we do on a daily basis. So we are here to help you guys. Other concerns that I'm always happy to answer questions about, but I won't belabor right now, is that there's a lot of more accurate information out there about these kind of fears in families of genetic discrimination. There is a law called the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, which protects you from genetic test results being used as a pre-existing condition for health insurance. These tests are so much more affordable now than when I first started doing this. When I first started doing this, most of these genetic tests were like $5,000 to $7,000. Most of the time now, patients pay at most a couple $100s. And that's only if they haven't met their deductible. And we can really help you try to find a provider to help you with genetic tests, either yourself or your family members. So in summary, so that we have time for questions and discussion, genetic testing is guideline recommended for all individuals with SADS conditions. The results can impact your care and your family's care. The results are not necessarily straightforward, and not all VUSs are created equal. And all of, again, the big cardiac organizations recommend a cardiogenetics expertise interpreting your genetic test results and in your care. When I have a plug on the next slide as well, you can go to findageneticcounselor.com. But also SADS is a fantastic resource. They have a great team that can try to hook you in with not only just a genetic counselor, but a genetic counselor with cardio expertise. So to sum it up in kind of the simplest terms, how do you talk to your family members about your SADS condition and about genetic and cardiac screening, whichever may be recommended to them? So I kind of broke it down into these 4 steps. Number 1 is you have to talk to your family, either in writing or verbally. If you don't tell them about your diagnosis, they have no way of knowing. And, you know, sometimes it can not just be, you know, the family miscommunication. In SADS conditions, if you don't share this information widely in your family, there's a risk to have a sudden cardiac arrest in your family that could have been prevented. And that's some nasty guilt that I have seen in families that I would not wish on anyone. So it is in your best interest to share this information with your family member, if at minimum, just so you don't have to worry about it in the future, right? So tell your family about your condition. Number 2, share resources with them. Your healthcare team can help you with this. I write so many letters that are just like, hey, take this to your doctor. This is what you need tested for. Share the SADS organization with them, things that can help them get plugged into testing. This is a little bit what I talked about earlier. Holiday time is a great time to potentially talk about this. And I've actually had a patient that suggested this could be something you send out with your holiday cards, if you do send them, or fun information if you send Christmas gifts or holiday gifts as well. So talk, share, and then ask your healthcare team or SADS to help connect your family to appropriate local clinics. People all the time ask me, hey, my son lives in California. Is there anyone he can see there? And I'll say, great. You know, he's in LA. I know the genetic counselor at Cedars. Let me connect you to them. This is a very common practice with most genetic counselors that I know. And then the 4th thing I think is important is to give your family a little bit of grace. Follow up as needed. I don't think you will ever regret revisiting this conversation if you don't feel like it was followed through on the first time. It is very common to what we call ostrich with this information, like putting your head on the ground like this not happening, because it's scary to be told that you are potentially at risk for a sudden death condition. And most people, frankly, don't want to hear it, don't want to talk about it, and want that to be a you problem and not an us problem. So you may need to give them a little bit of time and follow up on it over the years. But it really, really, like I said, in no cases will you regret that. It can only potentially benefit your family members to make sure they're being taken care of. So that's kind of the how-to action plan as you go into Thanksgiving weekend. And so now I'll be happy to take questions. I just wanted to say happy Thanksgiving and show you guys, this was our ARVC team on Monday. We had a little Friendsgiving lunch. And so we're wishing you and yours a happy holidays as well. And Marsha, you can turn loose any questions or discussion to me now as well.
Thank you so much, Brittany. This was wonderful. You can, if you want to stop sharing your screen, then we can have full screen with all the folks. Anyone that has a question, you may post it in the chat field, or you can raise your hand and I'll have you unmute and you can ask your questions verbally to Brittany. So well presented, no questions. We've got some now. Okay. Andrew, your first hand I saw. Go ahead and unmute yourself and you can ask your question. Andrew Jones. There you go. You're unmuted now. Go ahead.
Uh-oh, Andy, we can't hear you.
Now he's back muted. Okay, how about Mariana, you can unmute yourself. We'll come back to Andrew. Welcome.
Hi, thank you. It's late here in Argentina. Thanks for the great talk, Brittney. I would like to ask you, hi Alice, a brief question, because I have a patient whose brother died suddenly at 39. The autopsy showed a dilated cardiomyopathy without other specifications. They didn't preserve any sample for the postmortem genetic test. And this person is a 40. He has a subtle interventricular septum. It's a little bit more, I can't find the word, large.
Okay.
And his father has an abnormal motion, the father of both, of the anterior wall of the right ventricle. Invite found a VUS in this gene, and sometimes I get confused because it's a intron 9 plus 1. All the programs predict a damage effect of this VUS. Nevertheless, they classified the VUS, the variant as a VUS. And it's very low population frequency. So
this is, you're saying it was a splice site variant in Desmond?
yes.
Right.
It's a splice site variant, and they said that studying the parents would not help us to reclassify this variant.
Yeah, that's because Desmond is a tricky gene. I've had multiple cases of this recently myself. It's driving me insane. Haploinsufficiency, so missing one copy of Desmond, has not been documented as a mechanism of disease in Desmond. That is why all truncating variants in Desmond are considered VUSs, because we don't have proof that they actually cause disease. That's why they're classifying it as VUS.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you, Mariana, for your question. And Andy, we'll go to you next. I have you see your hand up. You can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thanks, Masha. Sorry, my mute wasn't working. My mic wasn't working before. My question to Brittney is, so for a VUS result, it seems like what we're now waiting for is either to someone else to join the database who happens to have the same mutation that you have, or we're waiting for someone else within our extended family to have some kind of cardiac incident. Neither of those sound like great options. So I wondered whether there is any research out there on kind of other genetic causes of any of these SADS conditions, and if there is any research ongoing, what that is and whether you have any information about it.
Right, exactly. The good news is also, it's not just who happens to join the arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathy database. It is in the United States, it's anyone that gets clinical genetic testing. There was a big push. It's a fantastic resource now called, which is I'm part of the clinical genome resource, but there's this big database called ClinVar, which all genetic testing labs have agreed to dump every single test result that they get completely anonymously with no clinical information whatsoever, but just like, hey, we've seen this variant again. And so that way clinicians can know without relying on things like, hey, this variant has been reported again in someone else. And then you can try to track that down, call that clinician, get permission to get clinical information, things like that. And so it increases the likelihood that we could find that out about other families with the same condition easier. That being said, yeah, you're just waiting for someone else to have it. And these genes are thousands and thousands of base pairs long. And so it's, hard to get someone with the exact same change again. It varies a little bit depending on your SADS condition. For example, the electrical conditions, all of our basic scientists always eye roll at me when I say just whip up a patch clamp. But for long QT, it is a lot easier to test the function of a variant because you're just looking at the channel current. That is overall easier something to do than, for example, in the cardiomyopathies, you have to build a whole muscle, which is expensive and very, very difficult to do on a variant by variant database. So variant by variant basis. So the answer to your question is not fantastic news. Yes, there's tons of research going on. It is just more difficult and slower in the cardiomyopathies than for the purely electrical conditions.
Thank you, Brittney. Thank you, Andy. Okay, Lori and John, your question. Okay. Can you do it?
Hi. So my question is, my sister was really into genetics and she had us all take our tests. And so I took mine and it showed that I was an APOE4 relative to dementia. And so that's like, oh my gosh. But then I went and I did some more additional testing and it turned out there's some alleles in the system, and one of them is a C, and I had two C's, and if you have two C alleles, it's a nothing burger, which is why my parents both lived till they were 95. So I'm wondering how deep into the thing you guys go. It looked like you go pretty deep beyond just the common stopping points.
Making sure I'm understanding your question totally, but yes, essentially that reiterates my point completely on why we want to make sure that you are having genetic testing with someone who can interpret the results for you. Many of the commercial testing labs now may have an on-call resource where you can do that, the public facing, where you can order it yourself. The genetic testing I'm talking about is clinical genetic testing that needs to be ordered by a healthcare provider. And my recommendation is that it's always ordered by a healthcare provider who can appropriately explain those results to you. so that you don't have to be worried when you get a result and you're like, oh, I think that this says a risk for something that it didn't before. But overall, yes, clinical genetic testing right now test the coding regions and into the intron regions in between genes. But we're not necessarily there yet where we're recommending whole genome sequencing as a first line test for all patients with SADS conditions, because it doesn't have a demonstrated clinical utility over our panel testing.
Okay, thank you, Brittany. Thank you, John. Rhonda, you have the next question. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I just had a question regarding our family. I have a son with Brugada syndrome, and I have that Brugada son and another son and a husband that all have the same VUS. Unfortunately, we have two other sons that they're not willing to test, and I'm one of my that hasn't been tested is really struggling with that. My second son that also has the VUS has suffered cardiac arrest this year. And he has, so they both have ICDs. My husband does not have an ICD. I'm not really sure if I should be seeking another opinion. My oldest son that hasn't been genetically tested is really upset that they're not testing him. But with it being a VUS, they're hesitant. So I'm just curious your opinion.
Yeah, I always recommend anyone, even my patients that come see me, if they want to go to a second opinion can never, most of the time, unless you get a bunch of conflicting opinions and then you're confused, but most of the time a second opinion is encouraged and can't hurt anyone. But yeah, if it truly is that we don't have evidence to call that disease associated, that's why I presented that second example of a VUS that was super suspicious and then proven later to be nothing. We don't want to do that to your family. So that's why, until we're sure, we won't recommend testing in asymptomatic individuals. And your safest bet is routine cardiac screening, because routine cardiac screening is hopefully going to be able to identify early symptoms of Brugada.
Okay, so that's one thing I was wondering. So should my other two sons be with an established EP as well, just for like an annual?
Yeah, if they have a brother who's had a cardiac arrest, absolutely.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks.
And that's really, I think that's a message too. The default is, you can always fall back on cardiac screening in these gene elusive families, because most of these conditions we can find something, that's a clue beforehand that we can watch. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Brittany. Thank you, Rhonda, for your question. Andy, do you have another question? Your hand is up. I'm not sure if it's just remaining up or not.
I don't, sorry, let me try and turn it off.
Oh, okay. Just want to make sure we got you covered there. Okay. Any other questions people want to put into the chat or ask verbally?
Are you saying there's a bunch of questions in the chat, Marcia? Do you see those?
I am not seeing them.
I see them. I can answer.
Oh, there
them.
they are. Oh my goodness. Okay, hold on. Sorry. Let's see.
People.
I don't know how I missed. They didn't pop up. Okay, let's go back now. Let's see here. Okay, Regina's asking, when do you recommend retesting for someone with a VUS?
Right. That it gets a little bit tricky because it depends on how old the VUS is and current interpretation. But I always tell my patients we recommend checking in for a reassessment at least every 3 to 5 years. Every 3 to 5 years, contact your physician and they can do a reanalysis. And that kind of gets into Nella's question as well. She had asked about how do you find out if your VUS is upgraded or downgraded? It's the same thing. It's really tricky because that information will go to your ordering physician. So that's an important distinction. Because if you came to see me with your result and wanted me to explain it to you, but I didn't order that test, I will not get the upgraded report. However, I can always, if you ask me, I can look into what my assessment is if I think if something should be upgraded or downgraded. So there's not necessarily, you can go to ClinVar. It's a public website. If you just type in ClinVar into Google, it'll come up and you can put your variant in and see what the information is. But official word is going to go to the ordering physician. And it's tricky because the labs aren't really triggered. To Andy's point earlier, the labs are not triggered to re-look into a variant until someone else comes along with that variant. So a gene could have a lot of evidence, or a variant could have a lot of evidence for being disease causing, but someone might have never looked at that variant again if no one else has it. So that's why I always recommend checking in with your team every 3 to 5 years if you have a VUS.
Okay, thank you. And another question from the chat: what does cardiac screening consist of?
I'm purposely being a little bit vague about that because it's tricky to give a talk for all SADS conditions because every single SADS condition is different, cardiac screening. But in general, the type of tests that we're recommending is an EKG, some sort of ambulatory monitoring like a Holter monitor, and some sort of imaging at least once for a rule out, even in long QT. Long QT and Brugada syndrome, we're often putting in a stress test. The cardiomyopathies, most of the time we don't have a stress test. So it depends on your condition, but those are the type of tests we're recommending.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments, questions? Okay, thank you very much, Brittney. I appreciate your time tonight and addressing all the questions that came from our audience here. So thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thanks all. Thanks for listening.
Bye, Maria.